The book of Proverbs is basically a book of promises, right?
I'll make my own decisions. What a stupid thing to say. Lord, I need you every day.
Just like we talked about the book of Job and why it's canonical last week, we're going to talk about the book of Proverbs. We'll do Ecclesiastes next, since it's in our year of wisdom. We're going to do a lot of reading today, so get your reading glasses out if you're over 40. Strong's Concordance says that the word used here is mashal, which just means a proverb or a parable. Brown Driver Briggs expands on this. Proverb, parable of sentences constructed in parallelism, usually a Hebrew wisdom, but occasionally of other types. A proverbial saying, brief, terse sentence of popular sagacity. Prophetic figurative discourse. Similitude, parable. Poem of various kinds, the ode. The 3,000 pieces traditionally ascribed to Solomon. Didactic psalms. Sentences of ethical wisdom. Proverbs 10, 1 through 22:16, consisting of 376 couplets, chiefly antithetical. Proverbs are also considered maxims. Nowadays, I hear that word all the time. So, let's define maxim. Merriam-Webster says this: a general truth, fundamental principle, or rule of conduct. A proverbial saying. Oxford Languages says a short, pithy statement expressing a general truth or rule of conduct. Alright, I had to look up the word pithy because I didn't know what it meant. Let's talk about it. Merriam-Webster says this: consisting of or abounding in pith. Well, that didn't help much. Having substance and point. Tersely cogent. Oxford Languages describes it like this: of language or style, concise and forcefully expressive. This is what my CSB Apologetics Bible says. Proverbs consists of different collections of wisdom sayings. While several of these are associated with King Solomon, his exact role in their preparation is uncertain. Just a side note here, when he's writing the book of Ecclesiastes, which we will talk about, he says that he is the Koholat, which means the collector of sentences. And I think that's appropriate here, too. Let's keep that in mind. Solomon's interest in wisdom is clear from 1 Kings 4:29 through 34, which indicates that he authored 3,000 proverbs. It's likely that many of the proverbs in the book originated with Solomon, but given his interest in wisdom and the similarities between Proverbs 22:17 through 23:14 and a collection of proverbs from Egypt, it is also likely that some of the material in the book was collected by Solomon rather than authored by him. According to the statement in Proverbs 25:1, one of these collections was copied by the scribes of Hezekiah, and so our present book could not have been put into its present form until after 700 BC. Certain literary features make it likely that the book was compiled prior to the Babylonian exile. The literary forms designated by the Hebrew word translates proverb are considerably broader than what is conveyed by the English word proverb. They include concise sayings and riddles, as well as longer poems such as the alphabet acrostic describing the excellent woman in Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. Similar literary forms are found throughout the history of civilization and in virtually every culture. Apart from some explicitly theological material, for example, these Proverbs, the material in Proverbs seems to reflect the conclusions of people as they carefully observed the world in an attempt to identify the basic patterns that operate in life. According to Israelite thinking, the basis for such observations is the fact that God created the world and designed order into it, as Proverbs 3:19 through 20 and 8:22 through 31 make clear. Thus, the Israelites were able to recognize the legitimacy of wisdom that came from sources outside Israel, as is clear from passages such as 1 Kings 4:30 and 31, and from references to non-Israelites noted for their wisdom. The Israelites would have had no innate objection to accepting the observations of non-Israelites into their wisdom tradition. Let's talk about interpreting the Proverbs. Some have raised objections to material in Proverbs because it seems to command a certain behavior, but then commands a different, incompatible behavior elsewhere, or because it makes a general promise that the Bible appears to contradict or qualify elsewhere. Proverbs also makes what appear to be comprehensive statements that seem to be contradicted by the realities of life. For example, proverbs that promise long life to the wise and righteous, but a premature death for the wicked. An interpreter must be careful to interpret this material in a way that appropriately considers the nature of a proverb and the way its original audience would have understood it. Many objections reflect a failure to understand what a proverb is and how proverbs function in cultures that use them regularly. The types of sayings found in Proverbs reflect a way of thinking and teaching that has been largely abandoned in modern Western culture, which is where I am. Proverbs are general statements of truth rather than invariable promises or laws, and an individual proverb normally captures a tiny cross-section of truth rather than making a comprehensive statement about a topic. For example, a gentle answer turns away anger constitutes one component of the broader topics of using words wisely and dealing with angry people. I'm sure we've all seen this one in action. If I speak nasty to you, you're probably going to be on edge and ready to attack me back. But if I speak to you gently, it's going to tend to turn away your anger. Tend to. This single principle is one small piece of a much larger mosaic, and the task of the student is not only to put together the broader mosaic piece by piece, but also to learn to apply these principles skillfully to the complexities that one encounters in life. The goal of the wisdom in Proverbs is to develop skill in living according to the order that is embedded in God's creation. When a pair of proverbs seems conflicting or even contradictory, the first proverb moves the reader in a certain direction. Then the contrasting proverb provides a balancing principle to point the reader toward another dimension of the skill of living in a complex world. For example, Proverbs 26:4 says, "Don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you will become like him yourself." While the next verse says, "Answer a fool according to his foolishness, or he will become wise in his own eyes." The student of wisdom recognizes that encounters with a fool require responses appropriate to that particular situation. The student also recognizes that a variety of other approaches between these extremes may be the wise response, and the student's goal is to become the kind of wisdom craftsman who can frame the appropriate response no matter the situation he faces. I imagine we've all been in some kind of a situation like that right there, where you know that if you answer them according to their folly, that they're just going to blow it off and it's not going to do a thing. But there are situations where we know that if we respond to somebody, they might actually think it through instead. So these really aren't contradictory statements. Likewise, the ambiguity that often characterizes Proverbs reflects the same pedagogy and goals. The student of wisdom is challenged by the ambiguity to explore the possibilities for understanding the proverb along with the variety of situations in which the principle appropriately applies. The ambiguity also promotes ongoing reflection as to the legitimate limits for applying the principle. While the book addresses a wide variety of issues, it gives considerable attention to matters such as the contrast between the wise person and the fool, the importance of virtues such as diligence and self-control, the importance of using words wisely, warnings about sexual immorality, the responsible use of money, priorities, and advice about proper behavior in a variety of social settings. Most proverbs deal with the general and the typical, but their goal is to equip people with the skills to apply wisdom to the particular experiences of life. My NIV Archaeological Study Bible has this to say. Many modern scholars consider the notion that Solomon had anything to do with the writing of Proverbs to be implausible and treat the book as entirely a product of post-exilic era. In fact, however, there is no good reason to dismiss Solomon's association with Proverbs. Similar compilations from the ancient Near East date from Solomon's time, the 10th century BC, or much earlier. We're going to look at that article that it refers to in just a minute. Solomon's era was the most prosperous and sophisticated in Israelite history. If any period was likely to have produced works of wisdom literature, it was precisely this one. The book of Proverbs includes the following themes. Wisdom. The predominant motif of the extended discourse in 1:1 through 9:18 is that of two women, wisdom and folly. Wisdom is a personification of God's attribute of wisdom and ultimately stands for God himself, while folly represents false gods vying for Israel's devotion. The truth expressed is that there can be no real wisdom apart from God. To fear God is to begin on the path of knowledge, understanding, or insight. The other theme, practical living. Proverbs presents principles for godly living and has much to say about wealth, work, giving, and matters of the heart. The range and scope of its subject matter encompass nearly every aspect of life. This is that article that it referred to a minute ago. Proverbs 1. The ancient Near East has yielded a great deal of what scholars call wisdom literature. Texts that instruct the reader about life, virtue, and social interaction or reflect upon profound issues. The instructive or didactic texts like Proverbs were typically written with a boy or young man, my son, as the implied reader. These straightforward texts, exhorting the reader to right behavior, concern issues like personal morality, work ethics, career choice, or peer respect. The reflective texts like Job are addressed to a more mature reader, one who acknowledges that the world is not always as it should be. They lament societal ills and wrestle with complex issues. These categories are not mutually exclusive. Ecclesiastes wrestles with life's unfairness and perversity, but also instructs the reader. We could classify Proverbs as the workbook for a beginning or undergraduate course, with Ecclesiastes being an advanced or graduate school text. Wisdom texts may address the reader directly, as do Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, or have a narrative structure like Job. Wisdom texts may be presented as prose, like most of Ecclesiastes, or poetry, like most of Job. Didactic texts often employ simple two-line maxims and parallelisms, while reflective texts are typically more complex in structure, as in Job's more problematic poetic discourse. Other nations also had wisdom literature. A few examples from the ancient Near East. Egypt, the instruction of Vizier Ptah-hotep of the 5th dynasty, from 2500 to 2350 BC. An aged counselor instructs his son in how he should conduct his life. The instruction for Merikari, 10th dynasty, 2106 to 2010 BC. A pharaoh, apparently Keti III, initiates his son in the principles of proper and effective ruling. This text, reflecting the social turmoil of the first intermediate period, asserts that Merikari must earn the respect of the nobles through just governance in order to maintain his hold on the throne. The protests of the eloquent peasant. Oldest copy dates to the 12th dynasty, 1963 to 1786 BC. A peasant who has been defrauded of his goods pleads for justice from high officials, eventually winning his case and gaining a high position for himself. The text reflects upon the nature of justice and the importance of eloquent speech. The instruction of Amenemope. Oldest copy dates to between the 10th and 6th centuries BC. This text, which is remarkably similar to Proverbs 22:17 through 24:22, includes an introduction and 30 sections of teaching on wise behavior. Mesopotamia. Akkadian proverb texts. These writings contain pithy adages and maxims of the sort found all over the world. For example, one proverb states that an enemy army never departs from a city whose weapons are weak, similar to the Roman proverb, "If you want peace, prepare for war." Counsels of Wisdom. This Akkadian book of practical advice also addresses the reader as "my son." Examples of advice include a warning not to marry a prostitute and an admonition that the steward of a ruler's property should not give in to covetousness. The Babylonian Theodicy, 1100 to 1000 BC. A cynical sufferer enters into a dispute with a man who defends traditional notions of wisdom. The text originally included 27 stanzas, each with 11 lines, but not all remain intact. This writing is often compared to Job. There are, in fact, both clear similarities and sharp differences between the two. The Book of Ahikar, found on a 5th century Aramaic papyrus but set in Assyria and possibly composed originally in Akkadian. This text describes how Ahikar overcame the adversity of a scheming and ungrateful nephew, avoided execution on false charges, and proved himself to be the wisest man of his age. The story was translated into Armenian and Arabic, and the apocryphal book of Tobit alludes to it. The motif of the wise man who triumphs over adversity appears repeatedly in the Bible as well. We cannot deny that such similarities exist. The Israelites did not live in cultural isolation. At the same time, it would be a mistake to treat the biblical texts as just another version of ancient wisdom. In grandeur of scope, internal complexity, and theological profundity, the biblical texts of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes are in a class by themselves. Now let's see what the Logos free software has to tell us. The Easton's Bible Dictionary says this: the Book of Proverbs, a collection of moral and philosophical maxims of a wide range of subjects presented in a poetic form. This book sets forth the philosophy of practical life. It is the sign to us that the Bible does not despise common sense and discretion. It impresses upon us, in the most forcible manner, the value of intelligence and prudence and of a good education. The whole strength of the Hebrew language and of the sacred authority of the book is thrown upon these homily truths. It deals, too, in that refined, discriminating, careful view of the finer shades of human character so often overlooked by theologians, but so necessary to any true estimate of human life. As to the origin of this book, it is probable that Solomon gathered and recast many proverbs which sprang from human experience in preceding ages and were floating past him on the tide of time, and that he also elaborated many new ones from the material of his own experience. Toward the close of the book, indeed, are preserved some of Solomon's own sayings that seem to have fallen from his lips in later life and been gathered by other hands. This book is usually divided into 3 parts, consisting of chapters 1 through 9, which contain an exhibition of wisdom as the highest good, consisting of chapter 10 through 24, containing Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, collected, which are chapters 25 through 29. These are followed by two supplements, the words of Agur and the words of King Lemuel, which are chapters 30 and 31. Solomon is said to have written 3,000 proverbs, and those contained in this book may be a selection from these, from 1 Kings 4:32. In the New Testament, there are 35 direct quotations from this book or allusions to it. Parsing Proverbs. Proverbs have characteristic formulations which, in the Old Testament, commonly employ motifs from Hebrew poetry such as parallelism, alliteration, chiasm, wordplay, linked in acrostic. These features assist in memorization and keep terseness limited by the poetic formula. Proverbs most commonly occur in couplets, A and B. They occur in recognizable literary forms and patterns, though these methods often contain overlap. The method of parallelism, by which the point is achieved, is one way to categorize Proverbs. Synonymous parallelism, antithetic parallelism, or synthetic parallelism. Synonymous proverbs make a simile between A and B or equate A with B. Bruce Waltke and Andrew Steinman argue that Solomon authored select sections of the book. Waltke cites 4 factors that support the authenticity of Solomon's authorship. The history in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles matches Proverbs. The structure and content of Proverbs is similar to comparable wisdom literature from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other cultures in the region dating from the time period of Solomon's reign. Linguistic evidence matches well with Solomon as the author. Wisdom literature is typically set in the context of a kingly court. Waltke argues, why would a faker of the received tradition combine attributions to others and inconsistently give as the book's heading the Proverbs of Solomon? Steinman bases his argument on similarity in vocabulary, thought, and modes of expression. Agur and Lemuel, the authors of the last 2 chapters of Proverbs, are unknown men. Waltke suggests that Agur was a court official and that Lemuel was a king during the Hellenistic period. He notes that an unnamed editor compiled Proverbs into its final form sometime during the Persian period, 540 BC to 332 BC, or in the Hellenistic era. Comparison with Near Eastern wisdom literature. Israel's recorded history compares Solomon's wisdom to that of nearby cultures. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt, says 1 Kings 4:30. Wisdom from the regions surrounding Israel provided a background for Israelite sages and may have been adapted by them. For example, the instruction of Amenemope, an Egyptian collection of sayings, bears resemblance to Proverbs 22:17 through 31. Sumerian and Babylonian proverbs also overlap with Proverbs. These different pieces of wisdom combine in the book and direct the Israelites to God. Literary style and form of Proverbs. Biblical Hebrew poetry has 3 primary characteristics: terseness, imagery, and parallelism. Terseness. Poetry is compressed language. Truth in Proverbs is presented through aphorisms, concise formulations of truth. These aphorisms concentrate or distill truth, and so by their nature cannot express the whole truth about a topic. Read in isolation, a proverb cannot be understood as recording the entire biblical position on a topic. Instead, it must be viewed in conjunction with other balancing proverbs and patterns of truth. Furthermore, proverbs express general truths as opposed to guarantees. Imagery. Proverbs is characterized by imagery or figurative language, which is another form of compactness, enabling the author to communicate his message in fewer words. Examples of imagery include simile, metaphor, allegory, personification, and irony. Parallelism. While parallelism, the correspondence that occurs between the phrases of a poetic line, does not occur regularly in English poetry, it is common in Hebrew poetry. Repeated phrases are not merely decoration, but serve to emphasize the meaning of a proverb. Typically, Proverbs consists of two halves. The first half presents a statement of truth, and the second half intensifies or seconds the first. Furthermore, the two halves normally move from general to specific, from abstract to concrete, from ambiguous to less ambiguous, from usual to unusual vocabulary, and or from less intense to more intense. There is antithetical parallelism. The two halves present the opposite perspective on the same truth. Better than parallelism. One pursuit is better than the other. Numerical parallelism. A certain number of examples are provided as an illustration, only to be intensified by increasing the number by one. Waltke provides 4 guidelines for understanding how proverbs function. The promises in Proverbs are partially realized in real-life experience. Those who pursue righteousness and work hard usually experience positive outcomes as a result of their character. The terse and succinct nature of Proverbs means that an individual saying does not express the whole truth of the matter. Since Proverbs is meant as a primer for Israel's youth, it has the end in mind, one where the righteous triumph. Failed promises are vindicated by a blessed future that outlasts death. What constitutes a proverb? Thompson suggests a proverb could be defined as the wisdom of many and the wit of one. Proverbial phrases succinctly state distilled wisdom. Cultures from earliest times have produced sayings or observations about life. Thompson identifies 3 common features of proverbial lore: an arresting and individually inspired form, the wit of one; a wide appeal and endorsement of many; content that commends itself to the audience as true, wisdom. The Hebrew word translated wisdom, chachma, is an inclusive term that captures the combination of observation, obedience, careful planning, prudent conduct, and sensitivity to God's will. Clifford suggests the term refers to practical knowledge, skills, or political judgment rather than theoretical knowledge. The instructions in the book of Proverbs are intended to enable a person to be skillful in family relationships, community, and their relationship with God. Most of the biblical proverbs are short poems that can be easily memorized. They are usually 2 lines long and contain 3 Hebrew words on each line. Due to the brevity of this format, Proverbs cannot cover all possible meanings or nuances of the topic in view. The task of the interpreter is to unpack the possibilities that lie behind the brief statement. Hubbard notes that the compact format sometimes produces an oversimplification, since individual proverbs carry no explanations or lists of exceptions. Let's revisit the international setting for wisdom. Wisdom from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other ancient Near Eastern cultures provided the cultural context for the sages who collected and edited the book of Proverbs. Examples of ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian wisdom literature provide insights into the concerns of ancient people. Egyptian wisdom. Egyptian wisdom or instruction offered advice on how to live a happy, prosperous life by avoiding difficulties and mistakes. To date, 17 examples of Egyptian wisdom texts have been recovered, reaching back as far as the Old Kingdom. The extant wisdom literature from Egypt finds several parallels with the biblical Proverbs. As with Proverbs, the wisdom literature from Egypt is presented as father's instruction to his son. Egyptian instructions begin with a preamble introducing both the teacher and student, similar to Proverbs 1:1-7. The instruction of Amenemope is often compared to Proverbs 22:17-24:22, in part due to a reference to 30 sayings in both collections. The instruction of Amenemope is composed of 30 numbered chapters in which the scribe, Amenemope instructs his son on the way of life and urges him to rely on the god's wisdom. The text is set in the royal court and emphasizes inward virtues. The father points to composure, reserve, honesty, and kindness as the keys to success, and warns his son against dishonesty, lack of self-control, and greed. Mesopotamian wisdom. Several collections of wisdom sayings from Mesopotamia show similarity to biblical proverbs, including collections of proverbs unearthed at Tel Marduk, which is Ebla, that date from 2400 to 2250 BC. Collections of Sumerian proverbs, some of which were later translated into Akkadian and discovered in Ashurbanipal's library. The instructions of Shurupak, which are similar to the Egyptian instruction of Amenemope. The sayings of Ahikar, which contain practical counsels and religious moralizings parallel to Proverbs. They address the discipline of children, care in speech, avoidance of the king's anger, and controlled behavior. Ahikar praises heavenly wisdom, reflecting the personification of wisdom in Proverbs 8. The Counsels of Wisdom, a Babylonian or Akkadian composition that warns against becoming embroiled in strife and concludes with advice on how to deal with the enemy. Proverbs in the Royal Court. Many proverbs offer advice to young people in training for service in the royal court. And Proverbs 28 through 29 is sometimes considered a manual for monarchs. The titles of the Solomonic collections give these a strong connection to the royal court. Proverbs 31:1 is also tied to a royal court, though Lemuel is unknown. The royalty-focused sayings in Proverbs may have originated in scribal schools. However, it is debated whether scribal schools existed in monarchical Israel. Weeks says there is no strong evidence for the existence of scribal schools in the monarchical period. The earliest mention of them appears in Sirach, which dates to the intertestamental period. On the other hand, Davies cites references to teachers throughout the Old Testament as evidence that scribal schools existed in monarchical Israel. Von Rad notes that since scribal schools existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they could have also existed in Israel. Proverbs and Israelite folk wisdom. Some sections of the book of Proverbs originated as native Israelite popular proverbs and aphorisms. Such sayings covered a wide range of topics and likely have multiple points of origin. Rural and urban settings. Some proverbs classified as folk wisdom likely originated in a rural agricultural setting. They address planting and harvesting, care for animals, and the value of hard work. Other proverbs likely have an urban origin, such as those that refer to goldsmiths and fine jewelry. Proverbs 11:26 seems to address wealthy landowners rather than poor farmers, and the instructions regarding servants in Proverbs 29:19 and 21 seem to be addressed to masters. And family wisdom sayings. Proverbs 1 through 9 is presented as a father's instruction to a son and is characterized by the phrase, "my son." It is unclear whether these sayings really reflect a parent's words to his child. It's possible that they metaphorically speak of the relationship between teacher and pupil in a school setting, as was the case in Egypt and other places in the ancient Near East. However, this conclusion assumes that scribal schools existed in monarchical Israel. If they did not, then these phrases would have a home and family setting. Family wisdom sayings were primarily aimed at reinforcing the roles in a clan or community. For example, many proverbs are directed toward children or teenagers and address topics such as robbery, sexual behavior, the first fruit offering, and relationships within the community. Other proverbs are directed toward parents, advising on discipline of children, or offering direction on care and security. And religious sayings. Proverbs 3 and 10 include contrasts between the righteous and the wicked. These sayings likely came from religious leaders or pious elders who used them to teach young people. A similar situation may hold for the contrast between the wise and the foolish. Proverbs 1-9 is instruction based on the fear of Yahweh. Interpretation and use of Proverbs. A particular proverb may find a wide range of uses and application, depending on how a reader interprets it. Most proverbs provide no specific setting, allowing readers to recontextualize them. Culture also impacts the interpretation of a proverb. There are many proverbs that address the royal court in Israel, and modern readers may apply these to someone in a position of leadership. When a saying is applicable in any given setting, it carries the authority of the wider community rather than being limited to an individual. Many modern sayings are prefaced by the formula, as they say, showing that the saying carries the acknowledgement of the community as a whole. Hence, the authority of the saying does not rest solely in one person, but in the collective wisdom of everyone. So what do the Proverbs have to say about what they're for? The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand sayings of understanding, to gain insightful instruction, righteousness, and justice and equity, to give shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and purpose to the young. May the wise hear and increase learning, and the one who understands gain direction. To understand a proverb and an expression, words of wisdom and their riddles. Fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Wisdom and instruction, fools despise. My child, may you keep your father's instruction and do not reject your mother's teachings, for they are a garland of favor for your head and pendants for your neck. The Proverbs are not promises to us, but they are wise things to live by. Therefore, instruction and thinking through things. And that is why the Proverbs are in our canon.
We were made to love, we were made to
And
give.
as always, thank you so much for being here today. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right there and click the bell so you can get notifications. And if you wouldn't mind, hit that like button for me. And I will see you next
So let
time.
his love shine through in everything we do. It's all for love. He commanded above all things to love the Lord with all our mind, heart, soul, and strength for all of time. Give your heart to the one who was there at the start. We were made to love, we were made to give. The reason why we're here, the reason why He gave us life. We were made to show the love of Christ. We know this is why we're here, this is why He gave us life. So let His love shine through in everything we do. It's all for love. Greater love has no one but this, that He lay His life down for a friend. Build each other up, don't cease, it's never enough. And now that He's washed me clean, I wanna follow where He